Hello, ladies and gents, and welcome back to the Humanities class and our brief little unit on the medieval period. And today we are starting, and we are definitely going to try to finish the segment on Dante's Divine Comedy. Now, the Divine Comedy is one of the greatest works in the Western canon of literature. So we are already doing a huge disservice, like we did with the Iliad and the Odyssey, of just kind of blasting through a quick little summary of it, essentially. However, I have a small defense about that, and it's simply that I'm trying to not necessarily give you a literary, conceptual sort of understanding of this particular work, but we're trying to view the Divine Comedy and Dante's themes and his ideas within it as sort of a window into the worldview of the medieval era, okay, the medieval period, the Dark Ages, as we are falsely calling them last video. We're trying to use this work as sort of an emblematic example as to how these guys thought and what the philosophies and the religious sort of ideas were at the time, okay? Now, that being said, as we go through it, we have to understand that Dante is writing during a particular year, during a particular century, in a particular place, influenced by particular traditions and opinions. So does this mean that every single Catholic for the 1,000 years of medieval history thought what Dante is thinking? Generally, no, okay? There are details that they differ on. The Catholic tradition is, again, contrary to what we might expect, quite diverse actually, and its approaches and its views on things. You know, generally uniform on some basic uniforming ideas, but still pretty diverse in what it thinks about particular doctrines and particular practices and sacraments and all this kind of stuff. So, if you're following along with our class notes, they look something like this, okay? Just the Divine Comedy. We're going to get some general, basic information out of the way in the beginning, and then we're going to start with the Inferno, okay? So we'll talk about that when we get there, but let's look at some of the basic info so far. Okay, so Dante Alighieri. Who is Dante Alighieri? He is essentially the father of the Italian language, as my family always loves to remind me. So he lived between, around 1265 to around 1321. So not a terribly long life, but not a short one either. He was, as it says here, the major Italian poet of the late Middle Ages, right? So he's kind of heading towards the ends of the medieval era, as we start to see the transition of the Renaissance coming about. Considered to be the father of the Italian language. It's all we really need to know about Dante Alighieri. Very politically involved kind of guy. So, as we will mention when we get into the Inferno, Dante likes to put, a lot of interest and emphasis on, the political happenings in Florence, I think it was, right? Florence or Venice, I can't remember, of the particular Italian town that he was in, the city he was in at that particular time. So that's that. Now, what actually is the Divine Comedy? Well, if you look at it, just the title, La Divina Commedia or La Commedia Divina, it is a divine comedy. Now, you remember from our universal materials notes, there was a video that we did on tragedy, and in the beginning of that, we discussed the difference between a comedy and a tragedy. These are the two general structures of storytelling, where a tragedy essentially is a story where we have a hero beginning in an elevated place, a good place, and at the end of the story, that figure is in a low place, is in a negative place. It has a negative outcome for that particular person. Now, a comedy, in contrast, is the flip of that, where we have someone beginning in a kind of medium or a negative sort of place, and they journey and end up in a much better place, okay? It is usually synonymous sometimes with the hero's journey. So you'll see patterns of the hero's journey kind of playing themselves out in Dante's story. But that's essentially what we need to understand. It's a story about a journey from one negative place to a positive place, except as the title implies, it is at a divine stage. It is at a divine level that we're doing this. So it's not merely a journey from one country to another place. It's not worthy from one realm to another. It is the journey across the divine realities. Okay. So as it says here, it is a long narrative poem about Dante's figurative journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise. Okay, the three realms of the afterlife as understood generally by Catholic theology. Okay, we'll talk about what each of those are once we get there, but got to understand that they're probably a little bit different than what you think of in contemporary popular culture. Okay, so again, yeah, it says narrative poetry. It's using and telling a longer stories, often used in mythology, and is one of the older forms of poetry. So something very important to note here as we're approaching this subject, therefore, the reason why I included that point in that slide is that we need to approach this again as a piece of literature. Dante is sitting down in his life, writing the Divine Comedy, not as something that he randomly saw, as if he's literally transcribing visions he was granted by the Holy Spirit or something like this. That is not how he means this to be understood. He is writing fiction, ladies and gentlemen. He knows that he did not literally see these things. Therefore, he is not writing concrete fundamentalist theology. He is not telling us that this is what hell looks like, or this is what purgatory looks like, or this is exactly what we're going to see in heaven. Not at all. That is not what he is doing. Okay. In fact, I think there are segments of the actual the paradise section when he gets to heaven where he literally says that, where he says this is all just a way that we are using language and the visual medium to express the realities of heaven, which are inexpressible to us as mortals in this particular stage of being. So don't think that, okay? It's meant to be understood figuratively. It's meant to be understood metaphorically. He is trying to communicate some deeper truths that he understands through his religion with this work, okay? So get that out of your head right now. Okay, three main characters. We got Dante. He's the narrator who journeys through all three of these realms, these worlds, okay? So he actually is the main narrator and the main character of the particular poem that we're about to look at. His guide for, I think, the first 2/3 of the Divine Comedy is the Roman poet Virgil, okay? He guides him through hell and purgatory. Now, Virgil, again, real historical figure. We committed a grave crime against our Roman friends and our Latin scholars. We did not discuss Virgil in the Roman unit of this particular course. Go look at Virgil, fantastic poet, writes the third great ancient epic poem, the Aeneid, as a sequel to the Iliad and the Odyssey. Dante loved him. Dante was a huge fan of him, and so he uses his love for this figure in the form of creating a character of him as a sort of spiritual guide. He saw him as a deeply virtuous person, a pagan though, not a non-Christian, who he thought was a good figure to guide him through his spiritual journey. Now, he also includes this girl, Beatrice, or Beatrice, however you want to pronounce it. And she is someone that Dante is purported to have loved and have fallen in love with, or at least deeply admired from his early age, but who never actually had a relationship with him. And she's going to be the one to guide him through heaven in the later spheres of the story, the later segments of the story. Okay. So the Inferno. Okay, so as you can see, we've covered just the basic intro to these to this particular work. All right, we got who Dante was, the genre of literature. We got all that kind of stuff down to three major characters. Now let's talk about the Inferno. We have two questions here. How is the structure? And the really important question for number two is what might be the symbolic significance of hell being in the direction, shape, and place that it's in. So let's talk about this. Hell. The Inferno, Infierno. What is it? It is structured as 9 descending circles, each smaller than the one before it, said to be made from the spot where Satan fell from heaven. Okay, so we get the direction, descending. We have the number, right? 9 circles. We have the what do you want to call it? The shape. It is a cone, therefore. They're concentrically getting smaller. And they're circular, they're circles, okay? So downward, circles, cone. Okay. And it says to be made from the spot where Satan fell from heaven. Okay. Let's go through each of those and discuss the symbolic significance of each. So the first one is descending. Why is descent seen as something bad? You go all the way back to our video on symbolism in the Universal Materials essay. We as human beings in our imagination associate upwardness with positivity, with the divine, with greatness, right? If you are taller, larger, you are greater, you have more life, you have more power, you have more goodness in this particular worldview, therefore. So if you are upwards, if you are existing in heaven, the heavenly realm, you have a closer relationship towards goodness, to God, to all this kind of stuff. If you are diminished, if you are smaller, if you are brought down to the earth, like as you can kind of get the biblical reference, like a serpent, crawls on its belly in the dust. If you are below that point, you are further and further away from goodness. You are further away from life. Your life is diminished, right? You are more like an insect. You are more like a beast. You are closer to the dust. We want to get higher. We want to grow upwards. We want to become ascendant into something like heaven and goodness and life, not descendant, okay? So that's a general idea of the direction. Now, I think it was, what was the sequence we were looking for here? We need direction, place, and shape. Okay, the place. Why, where Satan falls from heaven? Well, Satan, in the Judeo-Christian understanding, is the iconic locus. He is the emblematic figure of all dysfunction and evil, right? So there is no this isn't a Manichaean worldview, by the way. This isn't the Catholic and Christian religion is not like Star Wars. There is no light and dark side of the force. There is no God versus the devil. That's one thing we need to get really, really clear. You're going to see that by the end of this particular poem. That's not how Christians understand the world. I think you remember, we might have discussed this back in one of our philosophers or in the Christianity discussion. Christianity understands the world in the nature of good and evil as essentially God as the center point. God is at the center of all reality. God is the ultimate reality. And everything else is basically kind of orbiting God. Everything is relative to God. There is no counterpoint to God, therefore. There is no counter power to God. There's just things that are further and further and further away from God, and therefore further away from goodness, and therefore further away from life, further away from being, further away from existence. So Satan is seen as the figure who is the farthest from God, who is the least like God in reality. And therefore, by definition, is the most pathetic, the most diminished, the most essentially powerless, the most evil, therefore, the most absent of life and love and goodness. That's who Satan is. So the fact that hell is surrounding this figure essentially tells us that the closer you get to that figure, the closer that you get to being like him, essentially. That's kind of what I think Dante is getting at. We are getting closer and closer and closer to being emblematic of this negative exemplar of virtue, right? Of this example of vice, of this example of true evil, okay? The closer you get to him, the closer you are associating yourself with him, that's where kind of you'll be in this particular world, in this particular realm. Okay, fine, whatever. The one that I think is particularly interesting, at least to me, is the last one here, which is the shape. Why a cone seemingly spiraling downward? Why circular? Okay. So I personally love the fact that Dante doesn't make it a singular kind of sphere or a tunnel downwards. It's not equidistant like this. It is a cone where we are getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Some of you will already make the connection. We are drawing a connection between what the word I was using earlier, diminished, smallness, lessened in existence. The more evil you get, the more distant from God you get, therefore, the more you go away from the true source of life and joy and happiness, the smaller you get, the more unreal you become, the more insignificant everything becomes to you and around you, right? It's really sort of this ominous sort of picture that you're going to see really fully see in its full context at the end of the Divine Comedy, because the point of view of Dante is going to change completely. You're going to see the whole world, essentially, almost from God or from the divine's perspective. Well, where, therefore, is the smallest realm in the Divine Comedy? It's where Satan is. That's the smallest realm. So to Satan, heaven or hell is essentially like this big. It's like just him, like kind of in his own mind, essentially. And that's what happens the further and further you go into evil. You become more and more kind of trapped and more confined within your own head and your own soul, your own tortured soul. It's sort of horrifying in that sense. And why the circles? A couple different reasons. Number one is that cyclical nature. I think Dante's getting at something there. You just keep going around and around and around and around. There's no growth. There's no outward movement. You are going further and further and further in, and as you want to use it as a spiral, it's getting closer and closer and closer inward. If you want to know a wonderful phrase, a wonderful concept of the medieval Catholics, all of Catholics, really, all of Christians, it's this notion that a sinful soul, or a soul that is truly kind of possessed by the cancer of sin, is a soul that is curvatus en se, or if you want to say it, en se curvatus, whatever Latin formulation you want to use. En se curvatus simply means a soul that is en se, on itself, curvatus, curved, or curvatus en se, curved in on itself. So the more that your attention, the more that your soul bends in on itself, focuses on itself, gnaws on its own ideas and own kind of world, the less full of life, the less full of joy it is. Now, some of you might hear that and immediately think, that sounds a lot like Buddhism. That sounds a lot like Hinduism. That sounds a lot like most world religions, which try to get us to abdicate our attention of our ego, start to get us to think more selflessly, think about others instead. Exactly. That's exactly what he's getting at here. So he's touching on something that is very much a huge emphasis of Christianity, which is the denial of the self, right? To the extreme extent sometimes. That's also touched on in all the other religions, especially the ones in the East, right? The Eastern religions love that point. Now, if you're looking at this from a psychological perspective, you might see that immediately light up your attention because you think, oh, well, the more and more you fixate on yourself, the more narcissistic you become. If you don't want to make it that dramatic, the more and more you focus on yourself, literally, the more pain that you will be in. We know that in psychology, there really is, I think, like one of my teachers pointed out, there's very little difference between being hyper self-focused and hyper in pain, essentially, because pain is your focus on yourself. Now, on another psychological level, you could point this out as being like psychotic, as going into psychosis. Like you are just unable to think of anything outside of yourself. You're unable to deal with the world outside of your own head. So you essentially go into psychosis, right? Where you're just like in your own mind and everything else looks like a delusion. Now, if you want to go on a philosophical level, that's called solipsism, where you literally don't think that the world outside of you is real. You think it's all in your head. So you can see what's kind of, I think Dante is brilliant here, because what he's getting at is that the further into evil you go, the further away from logic you go, the further into madness you go. You become more and more insane. So another brilliant point, like the sort of spiritual mathematics, the spiritual physics that Dante is setting up, is communicating here, is brilliant, where you have God as the main center, the main reality, right? In God is the source of joy, the source of life, the source of rationality, the source of intellect, the source of all these things. And therefore, the further away from God you get, the further away from life you get, hence the smallness. The further away from joy you get, as we're going to see when we get to the end of the Inferno, that's where the most misery is. And the further away from intellect you get. So the more stupid, the more bestial, the more like just absurd you get. That is essentially what I think he's getting at. One last thing, and then we'll move on to the spheres. I'm sorry, move on to the circles. That's the point, is why did he choose circles instead of spheres? Because once we get to paradise, he talks about the spheres of heaven. Well, a sphere is different than a circle. Okay, go ask your geometry teachers. How is it different? A circle is, by its mathematical definition, a two-dimensional thing, a two-dimensional object, whereas a sphere is a three-dimensional object. What's Dante getting at? Notice the difference. Hell is two dimensions. Heaven is three, and as we're going to see, even more than three. So it's going back to those physics, the main idea of the structure here. The further away from God you get, the less real you get, the less dimensions there are to reality. The further you get, or the closer you get to God, the more vivid, the more vibrant, the more solid reality actually gets. You'll see this actually come up as a quick last point here. You'll see this actually come up in a couple different pieces of literature. The one that jumps to my head immediately is Milton's Paradise Lost, where one of the angels, I think it's Raphael, explains to Adam, while Adam is in the Garden of Eden, that angels exist at a higher dimension of being, but they have all the other lower dimensions in them as well. So if you logic that one out, that means that actually angels are more solid than human beings. It's like that's kind of what Dante is getting at here, is that when you actually ascend into heaven, or when you get to heaven, that's actually more real than hell. Hell is the least real place in the world, because you're so diminished in what you are. You're so absent of life and being that you're like a ghost, essentially. I think by the way, if you're really interested in this, C.S. Lewis, and I might do a closer look video on this. C.S. Lewis writes a brilliant kind of his retelling, essentially, or his version of the Divine Comedy when he writes The Great Divorce. And he literally just takes this from Dante, but extends it in a new, beautiful way, where he shows the people who are in hell essentially are like ghosts. They're like barely visible ghosts. They're actually kind of more what we would think are spirits, like they're just spooky ghosties. Whereas the beings who are in heaven are the most solid. They're like what he calls spirits, they're like actually more solid and more substantial than anything that you would see on Earth, or anything that you would see in hell. So definitely getting that from Dante. Okay, so that's some general, long description of the symbolism of hell, and as we're going to see, heaven and purgatory as well. Okay, so what we got to do is we got to go through the circles, okay, the 9 circles. And we're going to talk about the notes on the circles, right? Well, who's there? What's the punishment? Why is it a thing? What's the sin associated with? What's the symbolic significance of the punishment? Okay, so again, Dante is not saying if you literally die today, you go to hell. This is what's your punishment is going to be. It's not what he's saying. He's saying this is the metaphorical, symbolic, poetic form that your punishment, that I'm showing you about the spiritual reality through this poem, essentially. So it's a metaphor, basically, guys. Don't look at it literally. So limbo, Dante goes into limbo. This is essentially the circle that's kind of before the gates of hell. Who's here? Essentially virtuous pagans, people who were not Christians, who were not baptized, who were not given the full revelation of Jesus. Now, we look at this and we see that this sounds extremely, what do you want to call it? What's the word in theology? Exclusionary, if you want, right? Not inclusive, but exclusive. This is exclusive Christianity, where you must have explicit knowledge of Jesus in order to get into heaven. Otherwise, you're not getting into heaven. That's kind of what people read this as. If you want to read it more symbolically, what I think Dante is saying here is that you must have some further revelation from God. You need God at some fundamental level in order to bring you out of your dysfunction, out of your sin, okay? And this gets to a real major point about Christianity that we didn't necessarily articulate maybe perfectly in the Christian unit, but the medievals had a very clear understanding of, and that is the true nature of sinfulness. The true nature of sinfulness, as the medievals understood it, and as most Christians and Catholics, understand it today, is that human beings, while having a nature that is fundamentally good, because of its creation by God, right? We are made in the image of God, according to Christianity. There's something that has been corrupted about it. There's something that's gone wrong. There's been sort of a spiritual cancer that's been injected into us through whatever version you want to describe the origins of that, whether it's Adam and Eve, whether it's something in the world, whatever. And as a result of that, we are essentially spiritually terminal, right? We are unable to cure ourselves, right? You can't cure yourself of the spiritual cancer. And if you simply allow it to go unchecked, in other words, if you don't change, you're going to spiritually die. That's how we need to understand hell from the Christian perspective. It is a place of eternal death. It is the place where basically you go to die, essentially. That's the true death, capital D death. And so limbo is, in this sense, if you want, again, to look at it a little bit more sympathetically, you can use the more hardcore exclusivist idea, like you don't know Jesus, you're not getting in, right? You're stuck. But what you see in limbo is essentially the results of people who try to solely rely on their human understanding of virtue, right? If we just rely on humanity, if you're a humanist, as we're going to see, if you're like a secular humanist, this is as far as you can get. You can simply hold your damnation at bay, but you cannot ascend to any higher spiritual realm. You must adopt some higher order notion of spiritual enlightenment, some notion of God's presence in your life and in your soul and all this kind of stuff. That's, I think, what Dante's getting at here. Okay, so limbo, right? The middle, right? We're not in hell, we're not in purgatory, we're not in heaven. We're just kind of in the middle, right? We're not able to really progress. You're stagnant, essentially. Okay, so that's limbo. Now, lust, circle 2, everybody's favorite one. Now, you can see, by the way, a sequence that's going to be very important once we get to purgatory, which is simply, hey, where's the worst sins going to be? Well, they're going to be at the bottom. Well, what does that therefore mean about the first sins? That means they are the least bad. Notice what I didn't say. I didn't say that they're good. They're the best sins, right? No. It's not what we're saying. We're saying if you want to put it in the medical term, they are the least deadly cancers, right? So these are the cancers that will kill you the slowest, in other words. So like bottom of hell, you got like stage 5, brain and heart cancer. Like you're dead in about a second. Versus like up here, it's like really slow growing, some other form of cancer, essentially. So lust, okay, lustfulness, the second circle of hell. Dante and his companion Virgil find people who are overcome by lust. They are punished by being blown violently back and forth by strong winds, preventing them to find peace and rest. Okay, so important conversation here. What is lust? Most people, again, who have a tertiary or passing understanding of religion, look at lust and think, okay, that means like any sexual desire, any thoughts of sex at all. That's what lust is. You're going to hell. you engage in sex, you get any kind of like hot and heavy sexual activity, you're going straight to hell. You're circle number 2. No, this is not what lust is. The Catholic theological and philosophical tradition defines lust essentially as when you are using another human being made in the image of likeness of God of infinite worth and value. If you are using these other human beings merely as a means to your ends, we are using people simply for your own sexual gratifications. That's what that is. And your desire for that essentially overcomes you and controls you. You allow that desire to control you to the point where you are treating other people with less dignity than they deserve, essentially. Now, a couple things. Why, therefore, does Dante use the punishment of winds, right? Why winds? Well, I mean, a couple different things. I usually open up to my students. I ask, what's the symbolism here? And a lot of them usually will say, well, it's sort of like, they'll say one of two things. They'll say it's a mimicry or it's a symbol of what your passions are like. Your passions are like the winds, right? They essentially go this way, that way. They're this, intense, they're that intense, they're this gentle, whatever. They change, they're changeable. And if you allow yourself to be governed by them, then you're essentially like a leaf in the wind, being blown about wherever it takes you. In other words, you have no autonomy. You are controlled by your passions, like the wind. Okay, that's one way to look at this. Some of my other students, usually my female students, will say, it blows you around because when you behave and you live a lustful life, you are left empty. You are left with a lack of substance in you. You are void inside. You're just this like gaping chasm, this emptiness in your soul because you're not truly loving people. You're trying to fill that void of your life, that void in your soul for happiness and joy and intimacy. You're trying to fill it with something that cannot fill it, which is just the wrong type of food. In other words, meaningless sex. So as a result, you are empty and you are just it's insubstantial that even wind will blow you away. I think both of those are valid. I think those are wonderful interpretations. So that I think might be some basic symbolism there. Okay. Gluttony. What is gluttony? As it says here before we get there, when reaching the third circle of hell, Dante and Virgil find souls of gluttons who are overlooked by a worm monster, Cerberus. Sinners in this circle of hell are punished by being forced to lie in a vile slush that is produced by never-ending icy rain. Okay, gluttons are people who have an unhealthy appetite, an unhealthy, or if you want to say it in modern day terms, an unhealthy relationship with their appetites, usually referring to food, right? So they are essentially pressed into this vile slush. Now, the obvious example here, the obvious interpretation is that, if you're so picky, you're so obsessed with what it is you're trying to eat, right? What it is you're trying to take into life. Well, you're going to get the worst of whatever's left over, right? We're going to just kind of drop in front of you the worst of what we have to offer, essentially. Now, Dante moves forward again, and we see greed. Now, greed, the symbolism here is a little bit more basic, right? In the fourth circle, we see the souls of people who are punished by greed. They are divided into two groups: those who must push boulders to the center of a ring, and those who must push them back outside the ring. Okay, little bit of a reference there to the Sisyphus punishment, where you have a person who is cursed with repeating a meaningless task for all eternity, where you must struggle, 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 and struggle up a hill, pushing the boulder up, only to have it drop back down and then force you to repeat it at the end of the day, right? That kind of like existentially meaningless punishment. Now, the boulders here usually are, I think they were depicted also as like bags of money, essentially bags of coin or boulders. I can't remember exactly what it was, but the picture is obviously, the artwork was usually coins. So what's the symbolism? Well, it's kind of the behavior of the greedy, right? They try to hoard, they try to bring in their money, only for that money to be stolen by someone else, only for someone for that to hoard it back to them. And then it's like a back and forth, it's back and forth. It's the meaningless interplay between the economic materials, right? It's like you take some, I take some, I take some, you take some, and it's like we are obsessively, chasing this again and again and again. It's for people who try to hoard their wealth for themselves for essentially a meaningless reason, right? We see again the dragon sort of imagery going back there from what we saw with Fafnir. Okay. Then we get anger. Okay, a little bit more basic, a little more familiar to us, right? Fifth circle of hell is where the wrathful. Now notice the different terminology there. It should be not the circle of anger, it should be the circle of the wrathful. We'll talk about that in a minute. And the sullen are punished for their sins. Transported on a boat, Dante and Virgil see the wrathful fighting each other on the surface of the river Styx, and the sullen gurgling beneath the surface of the water. Right? So they're drowning in this river of death, essentially, strangling each other inside there. Drowning in your anger, drowning in your wrath, drowning in your, notice the river, your death, essentially. It's just a cycle, an endless cycle of death. That's all that wrath really is. I'm saying keep the distinction between wrath and anger in your mind for a minute, because when we get to purgatory, we're going to need to make a distinction between those. Okay, so that's circle 5. Heresy, circle 6. Okay, a little bit of a new one, something we're not usually familiar with in these particular days. It's people who have taught false philosophies, false religions, essentially, or things that are deeply against the religions. Now, look at the example that he gave. I'm going to focus on one example. He says that they are encased in flaming tombs, condemned for eternity to be encased in these flaming tombs, in this, tomb of punishment. Epicurus is one of the people he puts there, this Greek philosopher who is one of the original, if you want, atheist philosophers, someone who denied the existence of any afterlife. Well, he is encased in a tomb that is on fire on the inside. What's the symbolism here? I mean, it's kind of obvious. My students usually say, okay, well, if you want to say that there's nothing after death, that death is the end, it's going to be the end for you. You're going to be locked in your tomb forever. You know, a little bit on the nose, sure. I particularly like, and why is this one so severe, so dark, and so kind of below all the other ones, right? We would have thought, heresy, oh, you taught something wrong, whatever, okay? Well, I think Dante is treating this one so seriously because as a teacher, I have seen, I should say, where I'm at right now, I don't see this very often, but I see teachers teaching things. I have seen teachers teaching things that I think is essentially deeply wrong, deeply immoral, deeply against the fundamental nature of reality, the fundamental nature of goodness. And in Dante's worldview, in Dante's era, at a religious level, that's called heresy, right? If you teach something that's against the Christian faith, you're a heretic. Now, I think it's also you have to also technically be in the Christian church. You have to be in the religion and be teaching something false therein, also to be considered a heretic. But no, actually, no, it's incorrect. I'm sorry. No, you can be outside the church and be a heretic still. You're not exempt. Um, why is this so bad? I like to use, and you might remember this, and I think I might include this in my teaching philosophy videos, but I use the example of something like nihilism. If you walk around as a teacher teaching children that life is fundamentally meaningless and there is no good or evil, there is no purpose to life, there is no right or wrong, nothing really matters in the end. If you walk around teaching children that, this deeply, wicked and contrary to our entire civilization philosophy, this philosophy that is in some sense the ultimate philosophy of violence and suicide, that's awful. That's evil. If you're teaching a mind that is young and susceptible and learning about the world, you're teaching them this, what I believe is a grotesque lie, a disgusting lie of nihilism. That's awful. That's evil. And Dante, being a Christian, being someone who thinks quite literally the complete opposite, right? If you're like that, no, life is maximally meaningful. Things are ridiculously meaningful. No, he thinks that this is awful. You should absolutely be punished for this. This is awful. And I think what's implied, by the way, by his choices is that there's some level of intentionality about it, right? You almost sort of sense that it's false, but you're still teaching it, right? There's got to be some level of awareness here, but he puts it at level 6, so it's pretty nasty. Okay, violence, right? So notice not just wrathful. Notice wrath is an internal thing, is more internal, like you're constantly seething with unjust anger and resentment at the world and people, whereas with violence, you're actually committing something. You're actually doing it in some way, shape, or form. So there's a couple different ways. There's a couple different sequences here. Let's take a look. The seventh circle is divided into 3 rings. The outer ring houses murderers, others who are violent to other people and property. Here, Dante sees them sink into a river of boiling blood and fire. Wonderfully graphic, you know. Suicides have been turned into trees and bushes, which are fed upon by harpies. But he also sees their profligates chased on and torn into pieces by dogs. Now, if I remember, I jumped ahead. If I remember correctly, he also has sodomites down here. He also puts homosexuals down here as well. Now, I think it's on Circle 7. I could be wrong about that. But let's talk about this for a minute. The violence makes total sense, right? You're in drowning in boiling blood, you're going to, it's poetic justice symbolism, basically. You spill blood, you're going to be drowning in it, therefore. Now, why the suicides? Why is suicide in hell? Why? And this is, of course, a huge shift in the ancient world, where in the Stoic philosophies and in most of the philosophies of the pagan world, and like ancient Greece, we saw suicide, and ancient Rome, we saw suicide as essentially if not noble thing, at least an understandable choice. So the pagans were, for lack of a better word, very chill with philosophy. I'm sorry, with suicide. If you were in a situation where you could no longer live a virtuous life, the Stoics believed you had the right and you had almost the duty to kill yourself. We see it, in more distant cultures like, feudal Japan and the samurai code, harakiri and seppuku. It's the same idea. You dishonor yourself, you take vengeance on yourself, or you take recompense by killing yourself. Now, why does this change in the Judeo-Christian, with the emergence of Judeo-Christian religion into the world? We have a complete value change to where we see it even today, at least in the past 100+ years. It's been a little bit of a contest, but we see that suicide has been almost universally condemned as something that is wrong and bad. Dante expresses the same thing here, and let's understand why in the Christian religion. Well, if you look at the Christian religion, the Judeo-Christian religion, we see every life as infinitely valuable. We see that the world is afflicted by many sources and flavors of suffering, but we see in the Judeo-Christian tradition a nobility and sort of almost a calling to bear your cross, to use the terminology of the New Testament, to endure the suffering of the world and allow yourself to be sanctified by it, to try to pursue or persevere through it, or find some level to which it can bring you closer to God, and to not abandon those around you and all this kind of stuff. So there's a lot of what we usually have as arguments against suicide today. A lot of those come out of the Judeo-Christian philosophy, which Dante is expressing here by, again, is saying that one of the worst sins, in some sense, is to commit suicide. And the reason why is, if you want to look at it from a spiritual perspective, what are you essentially saying? Again, not saying this is what I believe or any of that kind of stuff, as always, but let's adopt the Christian mentality. Okay, you're given this life by God. You're meant to try to emulate God and trying to get closer to God and heal yourself of sinfulness and love those around you, love your neighbor as yourself, and all this kind of stuff. Well, if you're afflicted by something like depression, if you're afflicted by some serious medical condition that is causing you maybe pain and all this kind of stuff, or that's even Dante would not really use that as a major example. He would look at the deaths of despair. He would look at a death of someone who is in deep depression. Why does he view this as something bad? Because essentially what he thinks is, by choosing to kill yourself, you are effectively admitting despair. You are essentially saying that there is really no meaning to life. You are essentially kind of falling back to what we saw here in heresy, what we talked about with nihilism. There's something going on with that, where you're saying that no, life fundamentally has no intrinsic meaning, and I should just die. We all should just die. We should, as Job's wife says, we should curse God and die. And it's also, in some sense, kind of a spitting in God's face from their perspective, right? God has given you the gift of life, and you're throwing it back at him, basically. And if you want to be more mathematical about it, your life, from, again, a Christian perspective, your life is really not your life. It's a gift from God. Nothing really is yours in that sense, right? All of your talents come from God. God made you with those talents. It's really only your active choices that are yours. What are you going to do with what God has given you? Well, if you look at what God has given you and you deem it to be so awful and you just destroy it, right? It's like you're destroying this gift that God has given you. So you can kind of, I'm doing a really terrible job at trying to defend the medieval worldview here, but you can kind of, at least, I hope, sense some of why, sense some of the reasons as to why Dante would view this. Now, it's important to note that, and this is a great point about the Catholic Church, does Catholic theology change throughout the eras, throughout the different centuries? Yeah, of course. So if you go to the Catholics today, you go open the Catholic Catechism on page whatever it is, and look up suicide. Is it considered a sin? Well, yeah. Well, why? Well, we'll talk about that when we get to purgatory. But all that really means is that it's wrong. It's not virtuous. It's not a virtuous thing to do. Can it be justified? Can it be understood? Can we, can we have sympathy and mercy for it in the Catholic religion? Absolutely, as you're going to see. So, like, Catholics to this day will not say that, like, oh, we know that someone who commits suicide is going straight to hell. They will never say that. That is completely anti what the Catholics believe. So that's another thing. In some sense, Dante is, again, developing a medieval Catholic worldview here, where he's talking about the people he thinks that are in hell, or he's using people as exemplars of those who would be in hell. However, he is a little bit out of sync with the actual catechism as it is codified today, which actually claims no knowledge about who is in hell, if anyone at all. So it was always a shocker to my students that a lot of Catholics, even today, will walk around not knowing that the actual doctrine of the Catholic Church has nothing to say about how many people are in hell or if anyone is in hell at all. Now, the implications of that could be dramatic because that could mean that, wait a minute, that means everyone is in heaven, actually. Everyone has gotten to heaven. Everyone has received and accepted God's mercy and actually allows himself into heaven, maybe, right? So hold off on that. But you can kind of sense the interplay of how the beliefs change and develop here. So again, nowadays, do the Catholics believe everything that Dante was writing down? No. Do they believe in some of the basic principles? Yes, probably. Okay, but again, the way that they articulate that changes throughout the years. Circle 8, fraud, right? People who overtly try to deceive others. I like the versions, the different like forms we get. We get like pimps and seducers, flatterers, corrupt politicians, hypocrites. So a couple things here. The pimps and seducers, people who are, forcing others to engage in adultery and lust, whipped by demons, right? There's probably a lot of symbolism behind that. We're not going to dwell on it too much. Same thing with the flatterers, immersed in human excrement. I feel like Dante was just having fun with this one, was just kind of looking for jokes. Corrupt politicians immersed in boiling pitch, that's fun. And then the hypocrites. This one I will analyze. This one's kind of fun. Simply because we usually misunderstand what it means to be a hypocrite. We think when someone is a hypocrite, it's, oh, you are inconsistent, right? You're doing something that's inconsistent with your religion. Like, oh, I say I'm a Christian and yet I don't give any money to the poor. Ah, hypocrite. Exactly. Not accurate. That's not what a hypocrite is, actually. What you're trying to say in that past example, where I don't give money to the poor even though I'm a Christian, that means, or that is more accurate. What is more accurate to say is that you are inconsistent. You are acting inconsistently with your faith. You're a bad Christian, basically. You're not a hypocrite, though. A hypocrite is someone who will act and do something knowing that they don't believe it, or kind of say that they believe something knowing that they don't actually believe it and simply doing it for some other benefits. In other words, they are the ones who are breaking, I can't remember which commandment it is, but it's one of the 10 commandments that says, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Again, poor translation. The real translation from the Hebrew is that you shouldn't carry the name of God in vain. You shouldn't use God's name in vain, like for vain reasons, like hypocrites. That's essentially what a hypocrite is I'm going to say it's like a politician who says, yeah, I'm Catholic. I go to Sundays every day, rosary, all this kind of stuff, even though they're not. They're just doing that to get the Catholic vote. So that's what it means to be a hypocrite, someone who is completely lying, essentially, about what they really believe, simply to get some other benefits. I like the symbolism behind that because you're forced to wear a cloak of molten lead. In other words, if you're going to wear, the fake garbs of this belief or this religion, this is what it's going to look like, right? You have to bear that torturous weight, this falseness about you. Okay, it's great kind of symbolism there. All right, last two, really. Treachery. Notice the philosophy that's going on here. He puts people who have been traitors at the bottom of hell. So like we said, the sins get more and more severe as we go down, essentially. So notice, treachery is worse than gluttony. Gluttony is worse than lust. Lust is not as bad as treachery. Okay, so again, think of the cancer metaphor. The most terminal cancer for your soul, the active kind of way you could damn your soul the quickest is by being a treacherous person. Okay, now why is this so bad? Well, I usually ask my students, anybody been cheated on? Anyone been really betrayed, like by someone very close to them? And you'll start to understand the true dysfunction of this particular sin. Because in order to betray someone, you have to get close to them. You have to open yourself up to them. You have to allow them to open themselves up to you. And then you have to hurt them, essentially. You have to take their trust and their love in you and use it to hurt them, essentially. So it's this really kind of grotesque perversion of what love and trust should be, right? It's like, I'm going to, trick you into opening yourself up to me, and then I'm going to take what you have given me, or what you have shown me in your love and your trust, and I'm going to then turn it into a weapon and stab you in your most vulnerable place for it. It's a really demonic sort of way of behaving, right? And that's why, all the girls in the class are like, amen. They're like, they love it because it's awful. This is absolutely awful. This is why when you cheat on someone very consciously and knowing, willfully, it's just awful. It's a really terrible and dysfunctional thing to do. Notice, though, the symbolism here. They are frozen in an icy lake. They are frozen, not on fire. The bottom of hell is frozen over, right? So the joke, when hell freezes over, it's like, well, hell will freeze over. Didn't you read the Divine Comedy? Why ice? Why do we associate ice with true deep evil and not fire? Because you go back and it's like, I didn't see much fire. If I go back through here, I see torture, I see boiling stuff. Okay, fine, I see some fire there, but you got the river, you got this, you got that. It's like there's not a lot of fire. It's there, but I think it's there more so as a symbol of pain and a symbol of destruction, and consuming. But ice is the major element of hell. Why? Because, ladies and gents, ice, if you look at the physics of it, absorbs energy. It takes energy in, right? And it gives nothing out. So if I go to a cold window and I have I'm really worked out, I have a really hot hand, and I go and I touch it, what actually happens to the energy in my hand, right? Because the energy that's my heat. I have a lot of body heat, and that's just a bunch of energy swirling around inside my hand. As soon as I touch it, that heat senses, or that energy, essentially notices the vacuum of the cold, right? And the lack of energy in the cold, and it rushes to that particular place, right? That's what heat is. That's all heat transfer is. It's the transfer of energy to a place with less energy. Now, do you see the kind of spiritual dynamics there, the kind of personal dynamics? Therefore, cold is ever consuming. It's ever taking into itself. It's curvatus and se. It's ever devouring. It's never giving. Okay? So if you want, look at Satan, look at God in the Divine Comedy. You can kind of see where this is going. God, once we get to him, is going to be a being of light and of energy, of radiance, of ever flowing outwards, right? Of ever giving light and life and love. Whereas Satan, as we're about to see, and this is again the foreshadowing of that, is a being like the rest of the beings down here in hell who have committed treachery, who is doing nothing but absorbing and just taking in other people's love and energy and never giving anything back, right? So in that sense, yes, treachery and the sins that kind of follow it, as we're going to see in purgatory, are intensely self-focused, are entirely curvatus and se. They hold the self as the major motivator behind all of their doing. I betray you because I want something, because I need this, because I deserve this. It's I. It's this narcissistic obsession with the self. So therefore, all the energy around you is going to be sucked into you, right? You're like a void in space, essentially, like a black hole in reality. Okay. Now, of course, we get down to Satan. So at the bottom of hell, Satan lays ever weeping and encased in ice, with wings beating, causing the ice to continue to freeze. His three heads gnaw endlessly on Judas and Brutus, the betrayers of Jesus and Caesar. Okay, a lot of stuff going on here. So real quick, if you look back at our notes, right, we went through the 9 circles. Hopefully you got some notes there. Now, I want to jump over. We're going to talk about the other questions, but I want to talk about this one real quick. Question number 4. Consider the depiction of Satan at the bottom of the Inferno. Identify the imagery associated with them. Identify how Satan is being characterized. And what can we infer about the medieval concept of ultimate evil? What the medieval concept of ultimate evil is based on this. Well, let's break them down. So, Satan. First thing we get. He lays ever weeping and encased in ice. Let's start with the ever weeping thing. That is obviously a signal to us that he is miserable, in misery, right? In despair, constant despair, everlasting despair. There is no joy. That's why the medievals would completely disagree with any notion of a cackling villain, right? Of a gleeful villain. They would say, no, that's not what real evil looks like. True evil is someone who is just purely self-destructive and in despair, right? And they would say something like, a school shooter, a child murderer, a true, deeply sadistic individual is not someone who is gleeful, right? Only if it's a brief mask of their true self, their true self, their true psyche, their true mind and soul is just in utter pain and utter despair. Okay. Why? Because remember the spiritual physics that we talked about in the beginning. What is the source of true happiness and joy? It's God. And the further away from him you get, therefore, the more miserable you will become. Okay? Pretty easy stuff. Encased in ice, we discussed that before, the symbolism of the ice, why it is that you are, around this void of energy and love, of course, ice. Wings beating, causing the ice to continue to freeze, right? He is trying to escape, right? He's flapping his wings, trying to get out of his dysfunction, out of his pain. And yet, what does that do? The harder he flaps the wings, the more the ice becomes frozen, the colder it actually gets. It's sort of like, again, this cyclical nature of evil, this idea that the more you try to get out of it, the more harm you're gonna cause yourself, essentially. Kind of referring back to that cyclical imagery that Dante had. Perfect. His 3 heads. Why are there 3? Because Satan's ultimate sin, his true sin, is treachery, active treachery against God and all creation, yes. But beneath that, in his actual soul, his true sin is of overwhelming pride and arrogance, and the desire, therefore, to be the center of reality, to be God. I am trying to center all of reality and existence on myself. Everyone and everything is meant to serve me. Everything is a means to my ends, right? That's essentially his sin. And so in wanting to effectively be like God, he tries to essentially mimic him. And that's where we get this grotesque, perverted version of the Trinity, right? With the 3 heads. God has 3 minds in his being. God has 3 persons in his being. Mystically, of course, as we know when we talk about Christianity. Well, Satan tries to parody this, essentially, tries to be like that. But it's nowhere near as what essentially is the beauty of the Trinity, as Dante would see it. It's something grotesque. And why is he gnawing on Judas, Bruce, and the betrayers of Jesus and Caesar? Oh, because they're traitors, right? They're like the ultimate traitors, right? So they're getting this huge punishment for their ultimate treachery. Judas, obviously. But notice the gnawing. Why ever gnawing on them? I've heard it depicted that it's a depiction of someone gnawing on their past resentments, right? Because these treacheries happened in the past. And yet he is still sitting there just gnawing on it, not letting it go. I'm just going to keep feeling the pain of what was done to me, or what was done to someone, or what someone did. Again, kind of giving us a bit of a psychology of evil here, is that you're just not able to let things go. You're choosing to not let things go. You're choosing to actively hate someone and remain angry, even though you know you could let it go, even though you know that's possible. You're choosing, no, I want to stay angry at the person. That's usually very uncomfortable for my students to realize, because they're like, wait a minute, that sounds ominously familiar to at least me or someone that I know, is like where someone just chooses not to forgive, right? And actively chooses not to do it. Dante, of course, throws that right at us in the very bottom of hell here. Okay, so that's hell. Now, a couple little questions here. Obviously, that gives us some insights into hell, or insights into the ideas of the medieval's idea of evil. Now, for number 3 and 4, based on the map of hell, which sins were medievals most concerned about and least concerned about? Well, as you could see, any sins that have to do with like dysfunctional relationships, in other words, like using people, or out of a selfish and treasonous and treacherous sort of way, they really don't like that. So these sins and actions that betray trust and love really are nasty. They really don't like this. And yet, sins that are the result of carnal, physical desires and appetites are the least concerning to them. Not to say that they're not concerning. Again, it's not that they're not bad. It's like, no, but there's a hierarchy here. And we're going to talk about this more in purgatory, but just keep that in mind. They're more concerned about this interpersonal stuff. And then consider the inhabitants of hell. What can we infer about Dante, how Dante viewed figures from mythology and other religions and the church? Well, we didn't talk about the details a lot, but if we're in a full class, I would show you some of the names of the people that he sticks in there. But he basically is showing us that even figures in the church can be dysfunctional, right? So he, again, dispels with this idea that simply because you're in the Catholic or the Christian religion, that somehow gives you some eternal fire insurance. No, it does not. You can still end up in hell. You can still completely destroy your soul, destroy your character, and end up there, okay? Now, I think what we're going to do, I think what I'd like to do is pause us there, okay? So that's a good introduction to the Divine Comedy. So I'll do a 2-part Divine Comedy one. Otherwise, we'll be here for quite a while. So we've got a basic understanding of hell and the structure of this whole story. Now, what we're going to do in the next video is we're going to go from hell now into purgatory and into paradise. Something for us to consider before you move into that one is, why do you think Dante has to begin his spiritual journey of understanding and growth in hell? Consider that, please. Okay, we will pick that question up at the beginning of the next video. But thanks for all your attention, hopefully, in the journey of Dante's Divine Comedy. We will see you in the next video, where we go into purgatory and then into paradise. And then we will be all done with the medieval unit. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day. Bye.